Hey everybody, it's Tuesday. It's 3 o'clock. That means it's Tech Tuesday. I'll be back in just a second. Hey, I'm Rick Yuzzi at Zcorum. Thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to be talking about the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, or RDOF. Everything you wanted to know? No, everything I understand at this point. So it's a little bit complicated. But if you were involved in CAF 2 at all, the Connect America Fund, phase 1 I guess too. But if you were involved in CAF 2, then a lot of this is going to be very familiar to you, and you'll just be doing a lot of the same things. There's a few little differences here and there, but this is modeled off of the CAF 2, the Connect America Fund that the FCC did, and this is the successor to that. So CAF 2 is winding down. Some of the last awards were announced recently. There might be one or two others as they get the rest of those funds awarded. But I think the actual auction process is all over, and they're just awarding the funds now based on that. So RDOF is the successor to that. It's going to be a lot bigger, a lot more locations. So it's something to be aware of if you're an internet service provider, broadband provider, and you wanted to be able to participate in this auction, which will be for areas that are unserved basically, or underserved in phase 2 in what the FCC considers broadband, and that's changed over time. So I'll go ahead and get some slides up here. Bear with me a second. Make sure everything's going to be moving here. I think it's going to be good. So the RDOF funds, let me make sure my slides, oops, bear with me one second. It always takes a second to get going there. There we go. So the RDOF funds, it can be $20.4 billion over 10 years. And this is to areas that, again, don't have broadband service as defined by the FCC. So over time, the FCC has ratcheted up those numbers to what they consider broadband. In CAF 2, it was 10 megabits per second and 1 megabit down, and then 1 megabit per second up. For RDOF, it's 20.4. I'm sorry, that's the amount. So it's going to be 25 megabits per second down, and then 3 megabits per second up as far as the speeds that will be required for this. It's 16 billion in phase 1, and again, that's for areas that don't have this 25 by 3 service. They might have other service. They might even have 10 by 1. But they will be, if they don't have 25 by 3, then they're in any area, any of that particular census block, then that's considered unserved. And then 4.4 billion in phase 2, and that'll be for partially served census blocks, areas where maybe there's 25/3 in some areas, but other areas where there's not, and then anything that's left over from phase 1. Like CAF 2, the minimum bid area is going to be a census block, and they're going to vote to adopt the draft procedures on June 9th. The draft procedures came out last week, where they pretty much define the way everything's going to be. They'll adopt those at the FCC meeting on June 9th, and there's probably not going to be any changes. There might be a few little tweaks here and there, but it's usually pretty well set at this point. They'll meet, they'll adopt it. Any minor changes will be incorporated at that point. So there's a lot of good information up on the FCC now at this website here, fcc.gov/auction/904. So this is auction 904. CAF 2 is auction 903. And like I said, there's a lot of information up here. There's maps, which I'll show you here in a minute. There's, you see the eligible areas. Again, I'll show you some screenshots of that here in just a moment. But as far as the maps, you can see a map of the coverage areas here that are available, and then you can click and see the eligible locations in those coverage areas, and then you can click again and you can see the annual reserve price in those areas. And the annual reserve price I'll be talking about here in just a second, but you can see the darker green has got a larger reserve price for particular areas, so you can decide based on where you're located, and you can see what areas are not eligible. It could be areas that are in your service area. Could be areas that are just outside your service area, maybe adjacent, that you want to address in some way, maybe through building out. So again, the whole purpose of this is it's expensive to build out in some of these areas. That's the reason that there's not broadband there, at least 25 by 3. So this is a way to provide some funds to operators who want to go ahead and do that. to help defray the cost. You can drill in a little bit in an area and see the specifics of that area, and then you can click a little icon right there and then move over a little slider and make it a little more opaque so you can kind of see through those colors and see what we're talking about as far as the areas that are located. So that's a little bit about kind of the eligible areas. And again, this will be, there'll be some changes actually in this. I'll talk about here in a second. This will be pretty well set, but there will be some changes, and specifically because of some challenges. But you can also on the site see what is currently the eligible locations. There's 5.9 million of them. That's about 6 times more than were available for CAF 2. Each census block has a reserve price, which limits the amount of annual support you can get in any one area. And this is the same kind of thing that was used for Connect America, the Connect America Fund. So there's a limit to that in any particular area that the FCC will provide, and they've decided on what that amount is. So you can look at the amount, the reserve price that's available. And that doesn't mean that you're going to get the reserve price, because this is an auction. So just like anything, the price, most auctions, the price goes up. This is a reverse auction, which I'll explain in a minute. Price goes down, so to speak. So this will be changing, and the reason this is going to change, well, first off, let's talk about this. So the reserve price, the way the FCC puts it, is equal to the cost per location for all locations in the census block, minus the funding threshold of $40 per location, or $30 per location if it's in a tribal area, or if that area is lacking even 10 by 1, then it's $30. And what that means is basically that the FCC has defined what they consider high-cost areas. These are those areas where, for a service provider, if you're a broadband provider, it's more expensive to go because you've got farm areas where there's not very many customers per mile, maybe miles, or other kinds of issues that make it difficult to provide service in an area. They consider those high costs. But if it's below $40 or $30 in a tribal area, or not getting 10 by 1, then it's not considered high cost. So when they're taking the reserve price, they look at that cost per location that they've decided for all the locations in the census block, and then they subtract out those funding thresholds. A little bit more on that. So this will kind of just explain some of that. So there are some excluded areas in this Phase 1 auction. So the Universal Service Fund has already identified these high-cost areas to serve, right? So, and for these extremely high-cost census blocks, they're also going to be limiting the amount of support that's available. So we talked already about this $40 and $30, and then there's a cap on that for these extremely high-cost areas of $212.50 or $10 more to $22.50 if it's lacking 10 by 1 or if it's in a tribal area. So these are excluded as far as this auction. So this is not something that you could bid on. And then census blocks also are excluded if they were awarded funding in CAF 2, or if there's some other federal or state program that provides that was to provide 25 by 3 service. Those will be excluded as well. So these are areas that are probably already not in that list that I showed you, but there are also going to be additional changes in that list I'll talk about here. So this is the tentative timeline that's been set up for the auction, and you need to start thinking about these things, especially this first step, this actually second thing that's on here, the short form application. So the first thing is there's supposed to be an auction application tutorial on June 15th, and this is to fill out what's called a short form application. And that short form application window is July 1st through the 15th. So you have from the 1st to the 15th to get your application in, and you obviously want to start that early. You don't want to just go on the 15th and put it in then. The auction bidding tutorial is on October 14th, and you'll definitely want to attend that because the auction is not a simple process. It's a little bit complicated. There's a mock auction on October 26th. You'll also want to attend that because you don't want to make any mistakes. You want to make sure that you have been kind of through the process and understand how everything goes with reserve pricing and the type of auction that this is. And then the auction itself begins on October 29th. And then the long form application that's going to be, I don't think there's a date on that. That's to be determined. So they have not said yet, as far as I know, when that will be. So the first really milestone thing that you need to be thinking about is getting the short form application in. One of the things that's not on here is the challenges, or actually the final list, when they'll have the final list of the eligible areas. What I showed you and what's up on the FCC website right now is preliminary. That came out in March, and that's based on numbers back from December of 2018. And when they came out with that, there have now been 180 challenges, maybe more, to that particular list. And this would be operators that said, hey, wait a minute, there is 25x3 service in here because I'm providing it. And some of that may have changed since 2018. So there could be operators that have come out and upgraded their service or come into a service area and are now providing it. Frontier challenged 16,000 census blocks. And there's challenges to challenges. So people are challenging that. And they're saying there's no way that Frontier, in that amount of time could have suddenly provided 25x3 service to 16,000 census blocks. So there's a lot of negotiating going back, and the FCC is looking at all of these particular challenges and the challenges to the challenges. And then at some point, they're hoping the final list is supposed to be out and available before the short form window closes, so before July 15th. And that final list will include the final reserve price for each census block group. And the only changes that may happen after that would be the USDA had their Reconnect program, which is another program for getting broadband funds. And that just closed out its phase 1 auction, so any areas that will be getting funds based on that will be taken out as well. They probably got a lot of those already out, but they've been obviously doing funds over time on that, and they just completed that. So that might be the only change after the fact. So again, the application window from July 1st to July 15th, and that July 15th is a hard date and time. So you have to get your application in on time by 6 p.m. on July 15th. So again, you don't want to wait on that if you're going to do this. This doesn't obligate you to participate in the auctions. That's very important. So if you're thinking, hey, this is something I think I'd want to do, you can fill out this short form application, get everything in, and it's not obligating you to participate in the auction. It's basically you showing your interest, and it's providing the information to the FCC that they need to be able to vet you in a sense, to be able to be sure that the information that you're providing shows that you could do this, right? So that you've got the kind of financial backing and technology experience, those kinds of things, that you could actually do this. You can make changes to your application anytime during that window. So, if you think, well, I'm going to go ahead and try to get it in by the 10th of July, even if you certify and submit on the 10th of July, you can still make changes up until the 15th at 6 p.m. You just kind of keep certifying the application. So you can start putting in the application, you can gather more information as you're putting it in, you can make changes anytime during that July 1 to July 15 period. You can't change or add anything after the filing deadline. So you'll have an opportunity, after you click the final submit and then July 15th, 6 p.m. passes, you can't make any changes, but the FCC may come back. They're going to review all of these applications. They may come back and say, oh, well, you made a mistake here, or this won't work. For example, they say that you can correct minor modifications and address identified deficiencies. So an example of that might be, maybe you put in for one of the gigabit tier, and I'll talk about the tiers here in a minute. So maybe you put in for the gigabit tier and low latency, and one or both of those things, they look at your technology and they go, that's not going to support that. So they would come back to you and say, if you'd like, you can submit for one of the other tiers and not the gigabit tier. So you may have an opportunity to make changes if the FCC tells you what you can change at that point. Also, I mentioned here you can withdraw your application at any time. If you do withdraw your application, one thing to note, and I'm pretty sure that this is the case, I read it in a couple different places, that if you withdraw your application, you still will be under the FCC's communication rules. Even though maybe you withdraw it and you're not going to participate in the auction, you still can't communicate with any other people that would be bidding in the auction. And I'm not sure exactly why, since you've withdrawn it, but that was my understanding. So that's just something to keep in mind there. And I'll talk at the very end about the communications rules. So what do you put in the short form application? You're obviously going to put a lot of information about who you are as an organization, what kind of company you are, what kind of experience you have in providing the kinds of services that they'll be talking about here, broadband service. Your ETC status, that would be an eligible telecommunications carrier, and anybody who's providing voice service is already an ETC. But the RDOF, just like the CAF2, requires that in addition to providing broadband, you have to provide voice service in these areas as well. So it's not just broadband, you got to be able to provide voice. You've got to provide your financial qualifications. You got to list who your authorized bidders are, the people that will be authorized to bid the particular names. Let's see. Oh, you can enter as a consortium. So you might, and this is a really good way to do it, especially if you're new to this, would be to partner up with other kinds of companies that are going to be doing this. If you do that, then you need to have one particular entity that's going to be the lead, taking the lead on this, and they'd be filling out the application. Now, you don't have to be, I mentioned ETC here, you don't have to be an ETC in order to bid. So you might be like, well, I'm not a phone company and I don't, I'm not an ETC. You don't have to be an ETC to fill out this form, and you don't even have to be an ETC to bid, to go through the bidding process later. But you need to have your ETC status 180 days after the closing public notice that you have won an award. So the FCC will come out at some point and they'll say, okay, here's some organizations that we're providing RDOF funds to, and they name you there. And then 180 days after that, you have to be an ETC, and you would normally do that, be designated that by the Public Utility Commission in your state. Would normally take care of that in most cases. As far as financial information, you need to provide financial statements, so you can't, you're going to have to provide some details there. And if you've been providing service for 2 years or more, then it's a little bit less onerous. You can provide unaudited financials if that's the case. If you're less than 2 years, you need financial statements audited by an independent CPA from the 3 most recent fiscal years. And then also you're going to need a letter of credit from a bank stating that it will provide credit to you in the dollar amount that you would be winning should you win. So you've got to determine where are we going to bid, what's the reserve prices, how much could it all come to, and then you've got to have a bank kind of back you up on that. And that's an important note, by the way, that you can bid on as many locations as you want, but you need to realize that you might win. That could be a good thing or that could be a bad thing. So if you're playing the odds and saying, well, let's see, I'll bid in these 25 locations and maybe I'll win 8. Well, what if you win all 25? Well, filling out the short form application doesn't obligate you anything. If you go ahead and bid and win, you are pretty much obligated to provide the service in those areas. So you need to be really serious at that point once you're actually filling out the long form application. And actually do the bidding and then fill out the long form application. You need to be very serious at that point. So there are some tiers like there were for the Connect America Fund, and these have gone up a little bit, and the weights have changed a little bit. So if you're familiar with Connect America, this will be very familiar to you, although again there's some little tweaks here. So again, the minimum speed is 25 by 3, and the usage amount that you're supposed to be able to provide for customers is 250 gigabytes. And the way that the FCC comes up with that is they look at what the average is across for most broadband customers across the country in all areas, and they say, well, it looks like the average is 250 gigabytes that people are using, so we're going to set it at that. So that's what they set it at. So at the 25 by 3 and at the 50 by 5, it's 250 gigabytes. Then at the 100, the above baseline is 100 by 20, and that one has a 2 terabyte usage amount per month. And then also there's a gigabit tier. That's a gigabit or 1,024 megabits per second by 500 or 512, I guess, round it to the number. And then that's 2 terabits, again, 2 terabytes, excuse me, of data usage at that tier. So the weight here, think of the weight as a weight on your bid in the sense that it kind of drags down the percentage that you'd be paid. So the higher the weight is not good. So what the FCC is trying to do is do their best to make sure that people in these areas can get the fastest speeds possible, something that would be comparable to an urban area, for example, or a suburban area where you might be able to get gigabit service. They want to try to make sure that people in these rural or hard-to-serve areas are getting comparable speeds. So they weight it so that there's an advantage if you're going to be able to provide gigabit service. So that would be an advantage, for example, for fiber. It's a little bit easier to do that maybe on fiber. Or any kind of service that can provide that. Maybe DOCSIS 4.0 would be something that could participate there, and maybe even 5G, depending on how it's laid out. So they want to make sure that people can get good service. So they're going to allow people to go in at the 25.3, the kind of the minimum broadband level, but they weight it on that, and the weight decreases as you get faster. And there's also this weight for latency. So if you can provide gigabit service and you can provide a latency of 100 milliseconds or less, then you have zero weight, and you get nothing taken off of the support that you'd be providing at that point, right? Or the support that you'll get from the FCC. So the FCC will provide the support, and then this weight knocks down the amount of support based on what you're offering, as you can see here. So the latest ruling from the FCC was pretty interesting. So when this came out last week, they said that satellite companies cannot participate, or excuse me, they can participate, but they can't submit for the gigabit tier or the low latency, which is interesting because everybody was kind of concerned that Starlink, the SpaceX offering, was going to be able to come in here and do this gigabit offering, because they say Starlink can have a latency of less than 100 milliseconds and that it can do gigabit internet, but it's not proven really. So the FCC came out and said anything that's not really proven we're not going to accept, and that means satellite, even if you're low Earth orbit satellites like SpaceLink is offering. The other thing that they came out and said was that DSL, and originally they were saying DSL and wireless could not participate at this gigabit tier. But they've come out and said they can, but they will have to demonstrate, maybe not demonstrate, but explain how they're going to do it. So on DSL, for example, there are some technologies out that sounds almost similar to DOCSIS 3.1, where you've got fiber deep, DOCSIS 4.0, where you've got fiber deep, and you're just doing coax, kind of last mile kind of stuff. Well, there's, I guess, some DSL technologies that goes fiber deep, and then you're just doing the DSL technology towards the very end of that link. And then, of course, on wireless, there's 5G, and they're going to be able to, or have to be able to say how they're going to hit this gigabit tier and this low latency tier if they're going to be able to qualify for that. So they can be in the running, but satellite can't be in the running in this case. And then something else to be aware of here is that when you sign up for a tier, you're saying that you're going to be able to do this at 95%, at least 95% of all peak round-trip latency measurements. So it means pretty much when you're taking these measurements, you got to be able to hit this 95% of the time or greater. And then if you're going to be providing, well, you are going to be providing voice, you have to have a MOS score of 4 at least on high latency. So if you're going to be bidding on this high latency model where it's going to be it's going to be 750 milliseconds, then you're going to have a MOS score of at least 4. So these are a couple other things to keep in mind. And you're going to have to, there are going to be performance requirements as you go through this. This is a 10-year period that you're getting this money over, and you're going to have to, each year that you're getting funds that are allocated on an annual basis, you're going to have to prove that you're doing this. So like CAF 2, they've got these requirements. Now it's interesting because on CAF 2, it took them like the whole period of time now to figure out what the measurements needed to be and how people are going to do it, and service providers weren't really ready to take these measurements. So these performance requirements where you have to actually submit your results don't even actually start, I think, until July. And even then, I think there's a grace period where you're figuring out how to do it, and then you start submitting them later to the FCC. So I don't think there'll be that grace period here with RDOF, because it's the same kind of thing, and the FCC's figured it all out. And if you're going to be bidding, you're probably pretty quickly going to have to be showing that you're meeting these requirements. It's something that you've got to do, I think it's quarterly, if I remember, for CAF 2. and you have to have some kind of test points out in the network at a certain number of, like I believe it's 50 subscribers per state, if I remember, per tier. For CAF2, it'll probably be very similar for RDOF. So you're going to have to do this testing and then submit that to the FCC on a regular basis to prove that you're meeting the requirements, because they want to make sure that if you're spending this money, that you're actually providing the service that you said you would provide. The whole point of this is to make sure that the consumer is getting the value out of their universal service fund that none of us want to pay, right? So when you see that USF fee on your phone bill, that money is going to fund things like this. That's the whole point of universal service fund. It used to be just telephone lines, but now it's broadband. To be able to fund broadband in these areas so that we can have universal broadband at good speeds across the country. And that's where these funds come from. So they want to make sure that you as the consumer are getting your money's worth when you pay that USF fee on your phone bill every month. So what kind of auction is this? This is where it gets a little complicated. This is a reverse auction. So if you think about it this way, if you're going to auction something off normally, you're the seller, and you're going to have a bunch of people that are going to be bidding, and they're going to be bidding higher and higher amounts for what it is that you're selling. This is a reverse auction where the FCC is the seller in a sense, but what they're selling is funds, or basically the support, or these funds that they're going to provide in an area. So they've got a certain amount of money, a reserve price, and you're basically bidding against others on how little of that support you'll accept in a given area. So as you're bidding, it's reversed, because you're actually going to be saying, well, let's see, it's almost like name that tune. I can name that tune in 4 notes. I can name that tune in 3 notes. Well, I can provide that service with 60%, or I can provide that service with 50%. So you're basically deciding what percentage you're willing to accept out of that maximum reserve price. That's why it's a reverse auction. And this is a descending clock auction, and what that means is that they're going to start off at a high price or a high amount of support, and in each round that amount of support reduces. Now it's interesting because the reserve price, again, there's just a maximum amount that they're going to provide, but the descending clock, or the clock, is going to start at well over that reserve price, and I'll explain why here in a minute. In fact, let me get into that. The part's a little bit complicated. Here's the really complicated part, the math, right? So there will be math. So if you look at this particular formula, it looks more complicated than it is, but it might take a minute to understand. So the minimum means that they're not going to give any one service provider more than the reserve price for an area. So you saw those numbers, that reserve price in that table. So there's a reserve price for an area, and they're not going to give an operator any more than that amount. That's what the minimum means. The R is the reserve price, and then the P is actually the percentage on the clock, the descending clock. From that they subtract T plus L, which is the tiers we were just looking at. That's your performance tier and your latency, and that's basically the weight. So they subtract the weight. I mentioned how the weight is kind of dragging down the amount that you will get, okay? And then you divide all that by 100, and basically that comes up with your percentage. And this is the amount for an implied support that you would get. So each round there's an implied support amount, and it starts off kind of high because that P, that clock ratio, starts out kind of high. Everything else stays the same because the tiers, if you look below here, let's look at the T plus L. So if you look below, you've got your minimum tier, and you've got your, on the left, and you've got your gigabit tier on the right. So the highest weight, the T plus L, would be 90 if you're going to be at the minimum tier. That's 25 by 3, and then high latency. So that's going to be 90%. That's going to be taken off of the support that you would get. And then if you're on the gigabit tier and you say you're going to do gigabit and you're going to do low latency, then nothing's taken off of that. So it seems like right away, well, that doesn't seem fair, because if you started out at 100% on your P, which is your clock percentage, and you're going in at your minimum tier of 25 by 3 and your higher latency, then you're knocking 90% off right off the bat. But what the FCC will do is that clock percentage is going to start out way over 100%. So they may start out, I don't know if they'll start out at 170, 180, maybe even. But what they're trying to do is make sure that people that are going to be bidding at this minimum, maybe with a higher latency, at least have a chance, right? And you do have a chance because it's just some people may not want to do gigabit speeds in certain areas, so you do have a chance. So if they start that P out at 170%, for example, then we subtract the T plus the L, then you still may be over 100%, depending on where you are here on the, if you're high latency baseline, then you're taking 75 off of that. If you're baseline low latency, you're only taking 35 off of that if you're bidding there. So you can actually win this at some of these other tiers, and that's the reason that they start that clock percentage up kind of high. And then each round, it might drop by 10%. So each round, there's less and less support provided for that. So let's see if there's anything else here. So that's basically the math, and as you do this, as that clock percentage drops down, the percentage that you get will drop down. But one thing that's important here, again, is that minimum. They're not going to give you more than the minimum reserve price. So in this first round, you might have a gigabit provider, and here's why it does even out the playing field. You might have a gigabit provider that bids there, and the clock percentage is at 170, and they get nothing subtracted. But even though they get nothing subtracted, they're still going to be limited to the minimum. So it's not like they're going to get 170% of the reserve price. They're going to get just 100% of the reserve price or the minimum. Whereas somebody who bids on one of these other tiers could also be in that same realm because maybe they only get 35% subtracted because they're at the baseline with low latency. So you can see here that there's an opportunity to compete regardless of which tier that you're going to be providing in the earlier rounds. Now obviously as you get to the later rounds, that clock percentage ticks down and you get less and less support available to you. So this is why it's very important to go through the FCC tutorials on how to bid and then do the mock auction and those kinds of things to make sure that you understand all of this. But you got to get familiar with this, and obviously it will help if you have a partner or somebody you can partner with that's been through this CAF2 stuff before and has a really good understanding of it. A few more bidding details. There's a minimum bid area, again, is the census block group. I mentioned that earlier, I believe. Something else, if you receive support, you've got to cover 40% of your areas within 3 years, and then 20% more each year after. So within the first 3 years, you have to be able to cover 40% of the area that you said you're going to cover. So you got to get started pretty quickly on this. And then within the next 2 years, or within the next 3 years, you got to do 20% each year. So basically within 6 years, you have to cover 100% of the service, the eligible area with service. And you need to be prepared to provide to newly built areas. So even though your service area, when you win the auction, looks one way, if some new neighborhoods sprout up here and there, you need to be able to provide service to those within a reasonable amount of time. One other thing is you have to be able to assume a 70% subscription rate. So you have to say, well, if I'm going to build out at these particular tiers, I need to be prepared to be able to provide a 70% subscription rate. It's kind of giving you an idea of where you need to be. And this is why it's so important as you start to go through this process and start to build your business model that you really think about the technology that you're going to be providing, how much it's going to cost for you to run service to all of these areas at a particular performance tier with a particular latency, so that you know what your return on investment is going to be, and you know the minimum amount of support that you can accept to make it all work. So as you're going into this bidding process, you need to have your business plan really pretty much set. Now, to put in your short form, you need to have a good idea, but you don't need to have everything worked out. But before that auction actually starts, you need to be knowing where your costs are and where you're willing to go as far as how little support you're willing to accept, because that's what the auction is all about, right? It's a reverse auction, but it'd be if you were going to be bidding on something, you'd want to know where your maximum amount was. It's like, I'm not going to bid any more than this, and if it goes higher than that, then I'm out. Well, you need to know I'm not going to accept anything less than this support level, and if it goes below that, then I'm out, and you can drop out. Now, once you drop out, you're out. You have to participate. You have to participate in every round. So it's not like you can skip some rounds and then come in later. You have to participate in every round, and once you decide you're out, you're out. A couple other things. While you want to look at that 70% mark, you really need to be able to scale regardless of any estimates of your subscription rate. So if you're just really successful, there's no other good provider there, and you get up to 90% penetration, you need to be able to do that. You need to be able to build out to that. And you can't report a location is served unless you can provide service at the required performance tier, the one that you signed up for, within 10 days. Now I think that would be different if a new neighborhood comes in. But if that area was there and then somebody calls up and says, hey, I'd like to get service, you need to be able to get them signed up or get them operating within 10 days at that performance tier. So you need to make sure that you build in a lot of margin there as far as the performance that you're going to be able to provide. Make sure that you've got enough bandwidth and equipment and everything, provide the performance tier and the latency that you signed up for. I mentioned here no satellite technology can bid in the gigabit tier, and that tier is not possible, or is now possible for DSL and wireless, but they have to explain how they're going to do that. Again, you need to have your business plan ready. I kind of mentioned this, and your technical information in place. You don't need all the information for the short form, but you need to have it pretty well figured out. But again, you're not obligated. So if you fill out the short form, get as much information as you can. Fill out the short form. You can withdraw it at any time. You don't need to participate in the auction. If you filed the short form, it's okay. And again, you have to be an ETC within 180 days after being announced as a winning bidder. And also, I didn't mention, you have to offer Lifeline voice and broadband service, because that's required if you're an ETC. Lifeline voice and broadband service throughout all eligible areas. So for those people that might be low income, need to be able to provide that kind of service to them under the Lifeline plan. And then last, as you put this all together, there are serious restrictions and penalties, including maybe jail time if you were to communicate with other bidders during this process. And that goes from the time that the short form application window closes, which is July 15th, up until the deadline for winning bidders to file their long form applications. So that's from the point that short form application is accepted all the way through the bids, and then even the deadline for you to fill out your long form application. So the process basically is you go through the short form application, the FCC determines, okay, these companies look like they will be able to participate in the auction, and then you would be allowed to participate in the auction. Then you will participate in the auction, and then after you participate in the auction, if you're the winning bidder, then you fill out the long form application that goes into much more detail on the kind of technology that you're going to be using, probably, I think, more financial information. They're just going to get a lot more detail from you on that long form application. That's kind of the second interview, if you will. So the short form is the first interview to make sure that you qualify for the first step, and then once you win, hopefully you have everything ready. At that point, you then need to fill out the long form application, and again, you need to be an ETC within 180 days of that point. Now, you may not be ready to provide voice service right away. You might be able to provide broadband, over this timeline of being able to get the service in place, but you might not be able to get your voice service in place that quickly. But if you could do an outsourced voice service for a temporary period of time, that might work. It is required that you be facility-based if you're going to be a voice provider, but again, there might be an opportunity. I think there's some wiggle room or leeway there in the early going, since you have to be an ETC so quickly and be providing voice service so quickly, where you may not need to get all of your facilities in place right away. You might be able to do an outsourced cloud-based voice service in the early going on that. So that is the RDOF, everything that I know about it right now. And there'll be, as you saw from the timeline, there are things that are coming up here soon. So if you wanted to participate in this, again, make sure you start looking at what's required for the short form application. Look at some of those training opportunities that the FCC will hold. There are some webinars. If you go to that 904 auction site, just search FCC auction 904, and you'll get to that auction site. There's some resources up there already and some webinars that you can look at there. So give it a shot. Again, you can put in the short form application and not be obligated to do anything, but if you have areas in your adjacent to you that you can maybe provide service that need it, you would be in a good position to do that, and you can get some money to help fund that. And why not? If you can provide good service to folks in an area and get some money to help defray the cost, that would be a good thing to do. All right, so next week, oh, by the way, I don't have a slide up here, but if you would like to subscribe, just go down to the little subscribe button there on YouTube and click subscribe, and click the little bell, ring the little bell, and you'll get notified whenever we are live. If this video was helpful for you, please give me a thumbs up. And next week I will be here with Peter Olivia, and he and I are going to be talking about an upgrade that is taking place this week with our TrueVision application. A lot of you may know TrueVision. It's a diagnostics application for fiber and DOCSIS networks. And on the fiber side, we're really adding some interesting features on that, including a OLT summary screen that gives a lot of information about all of the ONTs on the network in one place. So I'll be going over that with Pete. We'll show some of the new features, probably all the new features that are coming up. Again, this week there'll be that upgrade, and then we'll be showing that next week right here on Tech Tuesday. That'll be 3 o'clock, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.